Western Africa, a region on the western part of the African continent, is made up of 19 countries: Benin, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Cabo Verde, Chad, Côte d'Ivoire, Equatorial Guinea, the Gambia, Ghana, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia, Mali, Mauritania, Niger, Nigeria, Senegal, Sierra Leone, and Togo. The region has varied physical features, such as the semi-arid terrain of the western Sudan in the north and the equatorial forests of the Guinea coast along the Atlantic. Western Africa is culturally diverse, with the majority of people belonging to three major language families: Afro-Asiatic, Niger-Congo, and Nilo-Saharan. Agriculture is the single most important economic activity in Africa. The economy of most of Africa can be characterized as underdeveloped. Western Africa consists of a diverse group of countries. The region includes Benin, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Cabo Verde, Chad, Côte d'Ivoire, Equatorial Guinea, the Gambia, Ghana, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia, Mali, Mauritania, Niger, Nigeria, Senegal, Sierra Leone, and Togo. Western Africa can be divided into the Sudanic savanna and the Guinea coast. The savanna area has grasslands, few forests, and little rain. The Guinea coast has heavy rainfall, hardwood tropical forests, and dense foliage. Culturally, the people of Western Africa belong to three major language families: Afro-Asiatic, Niger-Congo, and Nilo-Saharan. Western Africa features diverse physical characteristics. The northern part consists of a semi-arid area known as the Western Sudan, which stretches 2,500 miles from the Atlantic Ocean to Lake Chad. This plateau region borders the Sahara Desert to the north and the Guinea coast forests to the south. The Gulf of Guinea is also a major feature, with a coastline that corresponds to the continental margin of South America. The Niger River flows through the region, entering the sea through its delta in southern Nigeria. Additionally, the Senegal-Mauritanian basin is a flat depression, with higher elevations only on the Cape Verde Peninsula and in the southeast. Western Africa is home to a diverse array of cultures and languages, reflecting adaptations to its varied climates and historical migrations. The region can be divided into the Sudanic savanna and the Guinea coast. The savanna area is characterized by extensive grasslands and is home to groups such as the Mande, including the Bambara, Malinke, and Soninke, the Gur-speaking peoples, such as the Sanyafo, Lobi, and Dogon, the Fulani, and Berber-speaking groups like the Tuareg. The Guinea coast, with its heavy rainfall and tropical forests, is inhabited by groups such as the Igbo, Yoruba, Akan, including the Asante, Yu, Mende, and Wolof. There are an estimated 900 to 1,500 different languages spoken in Africa. Hausa is one of the most important languages in Western Africa. Other languages include Songhai, Fula, Tamashek, and Kanuri. The West Atlantic branch of the Niger-Congo family of languages includes Wolof, Serer, Balant, Limba, Tem, Kissi, and Gola. Trade and commerce have significantly shaped Western Africa's history. The arrival of European sea traders in the 15th century marked a new era, with the Portuguese initially seeking gold and trade routes to Asia. This led to the development of coastal trade centers like the Gold Coast, where the Akan people exchanged gold for European goods. The Portuguese constructed forts to control trade, but their influence remained limited. As the Atlantic trade expanded, particularly the slave trade, kingdoms like Oyo and Dahomey grew in power by controlling trade routes and selling slaves to Europeans. The demand for slaves led to warfare and political changes as kingdoms sought to dominate the trade. The trade in firearms also influenced the region, becoming essential for hunting, protection, and warfare. By the 18th century, Western African kingdoms were as powerful as those in the Western Sudan, with trade playing a vital role in their growth. Western Africa faces challenges and opportunities across various sectors. A significant challenge is the vulnerability of economies due to reliance on a few agricultural products or minerals for export, with fluctuating commodity prices and frequent droughts undermining agricultural productivity. Rapid population growth also strains economic development. However, the region has opportunities for economic improvement through population control and the organization of states into regional economic blocs to create larger internal markets. The discovery of petroleum in countries like Nigeria and Cameroon and the exploitation of minerals such as diamonds and uranium ore also present export opportunities. Additionally, there is potential for growth in trade of manufactured goods between countries as industrialization progresses. Western Africa, region of the Western African continent comprising the countries of Benin, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Cabo Verde, Chad, Côte d'Ivoire, Equatorial Guinea, the Gambia, Ghana, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia, Mali, Mauritania, Niger, Nigeria, Senegal, Sierra Leone, and Togo. Western Africa is a term used Britannica to designate a geographic region within the continent of Africa. The term West Africa is also often used to refer to this part of the continent. As conventionally understood, however, West Africa is primarily a political and economic designation and comprises all the areas considered here except Cameroon, Chad, Equatorial Guinea, and the Saharan parts of Mali, Mauritania, and Niger. The region may be divided into several broad physiographic regions. The northern portion of Western Africa is composed of a broad band of semi-arid terrain, called the Western Sudan, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean on the west to the area of Lake Chad on the east, a distance of about 2,500 miles, 4,000 kilometers. It is largely a plateau of modest elevation and borders the Sahara Desert on the north and the Guinea coast forests on the south. Rainfall in this region ranges from less than 10 inches, 250 millimeters, in its arid northern reaches to about 50 inches, 1,250 millimeters, in the south. The flora of the Western Sudan consists of the scrub vegetation of the transitional zone known as the Sahel in the north and a mix of tall trees and high savanna grasslands in the south. Lying south of the Western Sudan are the Guinea coast equatorial forests, which flourish along the Atlantic coast and extend inland for about 100 to 150 miles, 160 to 240 kilometers. Most of the Sahara and the transitional vegetational zones to its south, the Sahel and the Western Sudan, are drained, where there is enough rainfall to support surface streams, either southward via the Niger River system or inland to the Lake Chad basin in the east. Along the better watered Atlantic coastal areas, the chief features are, west to east, the Mauritanian-Senegal basin, drained by the Senegal River, the Fouta-Djallon and Guinea highlands, the Volta River and Niger River coastal plains, and the uplands of Nigeria's Jos Plateau and the Cameroon highlands. Culturally, the people of the region belong for the most part to one of three major language families. In the northern and least populous Saharan regions, Arabs and Amazighan, Berbers, singular Amazigh, of the Afro-Asiatic language family predominate. South of a line connecting the course of the Senegal River, the Niger River, and the southern two-thirds of Nigeria, Niger-Congo languages are spoken. Along the middle course of the Niger River and around Lake Chad, Nilo-Saharan languages related to those of peoples farther east predominate. These peoples are divided into a very complex ethnic mosaic but may often be conveniently classified by their individual languages. This article covers the history of the region primarily from the 11th century through the 20th century. Coverage of the region's physical and human geography can be found in the article Africa. For discussion of the physical and human geography of individual countries in the region and of their post-colonial history. For an overview of when countries in Africa were established or became independent, see List of African countries' independence dates. Area 3,059,702 square miles, 7,924,592 square km. Pop. 2014 EST. 375,477,000. Muslims in Western Africa. A reasonable body of sources for the writing of Western African history begins to be available about 1000 CE. 3 centuries earlier the Arabs had completed their conquest of Africa north of the Sahara and so came into possession of the northern to many of trade routes reaching across the desert to Western Africa. The lively school of geographers and historians that flourished in the Muslim world from about the 9th to the 14th century thus secured access to growing amounts of information about what they called the Bilad al-Sudan, the territory of the black peoples south of the Sahara. This information has its limitations. The Muslim writers, contemptuous of non-Islamic societies, passed on little of what they must have known about the organization of pagan black societies and tended to concentrate on and condemn what struck them as their more monstrous aberrations. Conversely, they doubtless exaggerated the importance of the Islamization that entered Western Africa with the Muslim traders crossing the Sahara. The earliest first-hand account of Western Africa is probably that of the world traveler Ibn Battuta, who visited the Western Sudan in 1352–53. Finally, the North African merchants did not penetrate into Western Africa beyond the urban centers of trade and government that existed or came to develop on the northern fringes of the cultivable savannas fronting the Sahara. Their Bilad al-Sudan was in fact only the northern marches. Nevertheless, the picture of Western Africa given in the early Muslim writings is of major interest. It is apparent that, right from the beginnings of Arab contact, the organization of the more northerly Western African peoples was not solely tribal. They had considerable towns and cities that were supported by a developed agriculture. They had organized networks of markets and trade and a developed system of monarchical government. Kings, whose claim to power was based on descent from the mythical divine founding ancestors of their ethnic groups, taxed trade and levied tribute on the agricultural villages through their possession of bodies of retainers who provided them both with military force and with a hierarchy of officials. It seems likely that there was an increase in the volume of trans-Saharan trade following the organization of North Africa under Muslim dynasties and that this growth of international trade with Western Africa stimulated the growth there of internal trade, urbanization, and monarchical government. Certainly the control of trade, towns, and government in Western Africa became increasingly Islamic in form. But it is quite clear that the foundations for the economic and political development of the Western Sudan were in existence before the time of contact with Muslim traders or authors. Early Muslim interest was concentrated on two major Western African kingdoms, Kanem, in the east, north of Lake Chad, and Ghana, in the extreme west, on the borders of modern Mauritania and Mali. The Muslim sources, which are broadly confirmed by local tradition, indicate that the kingdom of Kanem was being formed during the 9th and 10th centuries through an interaction between Saharan nomads and agricultural village communities. But ancient Ghana, not to be confused with its modern namesake, considerably farther to the south and east, had already reached levels of organization that presuppose several centuries of continuing development. The earliest extant Arabic reference to a kingdom of Ghana dates from the early 9th century. In the middle of the 11th century, the Cordoban geographer Abu Ubayd al-Bakri described its capital, court, and trade in some detail. The capital was made up of two towns, a stone-built town inhabited by the Muslim traders and a mud-built one of the local Monde in which the king had his walled palace. Their centers were 6 miles apart, and the whole of the intervening country was more or less built up. The considerable population was supported by the produce of surrounding farms, which were watered from wells. The court displayed many signs of wealth and power, and the king had under him a considerable number of satellite rulers. A principal part of his revenue was derived from regular taxes on trade. The mainstay of this trade was the exchange of gold, which Ghana's own merchants brought from lands to the south, for salt, which the northern traders brought in from salt deposits in the Sahara. Al-Bakri's description is broadly confirmed by archaeology. The region in which ancient Ghana was situated contains the ruins of a considerable number of stone-built towns that must have been supported by extensive agricultural and commercial activity. Those at Comprising are generally identified with the capital described by al-Bakri. The relatively extensive Muslim interest in Ghana was undoubtedly due to its importance as a source of gold. Kanem seems to have been less important commercially. The main interest of the Muslim authors seems to have been in the quasi-divine status of its kings, which offended their Muslim principles. Other Western African kingdoms undoubtedly existed at this time, but the Muslim sources record little of them beyond their names and approximate locations. Thus between Ghana and Kanem was Kaka, perhaps the nucleus of the later Songhai kingdom of Gao. Malel, to the south of Ghana, may similarly have been a prototype of the later Mande kingdom of Mali, which ultimately was to eclipse and absorb Ghana itself. There are perhaps three possible and not mutually exclusive explanations for the origins and development of the kingdoms that Arab trade and scholarship had revealed by about 1000 CE. The first is that they were the result of the invasion of agricultural territory by pastoralists from the Sahara who belonged to the Libyan Amazigh groups who spoke a non-Semitic language and were the dominant group of North Africa before its conquest by the Arabs. This is the explanation often given in Western Sudanese traditions and chronicles. From roughly the 15th century onward, many of these were preserved by local authors who wrote in Arabic and were Muslims, and who thus had some incentive to link the history of their peoples with that of North Africa and with the adjacent Middle East. It was also the explanation favored by European historians of the later 19th and earlier 20th centuries when Europeans were themselves conquering and colonizing Black Africa. There thus evolved the so-called Hamitic hypothesis, by which it was generally supposed that any progress and development among agricultural blacks was the result of conquest or infiltration by pastoralists from northern or northeastern Africa. Specifically, it was supposed that many of the ideas and institutions of tribal monarchy had spread through Africa by diffusion from the ancient civilization of Egypt and the Nile Valley. There can be no doubt that over the centuries pastoralists from the Sahara have indeed advanced and conquered southward. But not all of these were Libyan Amazighan. Some, such as the dynasts of Kanem, were Black African in language and culture. Nor is it easy to understand how mobile desert pastoral groups could be effective transmitters of ideas and institutions from the settled civilization of the Nile Valley to other agricultural lands in Western Africa. It would seem more probable that conquering pastoralists who did succeed in establishing new kingdoms and dynasties in Western Africa should do so by taking over existing monarchies, perhaps city-states, or even village-states, and amalgamating these into larger units. Some early Western African traditions can certainly be interpreted in this sense. This leads to the second explanation for the origins and development of monarchical statehood among the Western African groups. There is archaeological evidence for the evolution of a cattle herding and agricultural economy among a mixed population of Libyan Amazighan and Black agricultural peoples, now called Arn, in the Sahara by at least 4000 BCE, i.e., more or less contemporary with similar developments in the Nile Valley. The desiccation of the Sahara and the evolution of its present desert between about 8000 and 2000 BCE must have occasioned an outflowing of population in which the blacks concentrated in the savannas to the south of it. There, in favorable riverine or lacustrine environments, it seems reasonable to suppose that the same desire to avoid conflicts over land and water rights and to control and exploit agricultural surpluses, which had led in the exceptionally fertile but extremely constricted environment of the Nile Valley to the dramatic kingship and civilization of the pharaohs, should have occasioned the evolution of similar if less spectacular monarchies. It should be noted, however, that the major Western African monarchies known to the Arabs by approximately 1000 CE were situated not in the well-watered lands along the Senegal and Niger valleys nor around Lake Chad but north of these, in the less favored agricultural territory between them and the southern edges of the Sahara. This suggests that a third factor in the evolution of these northern monarchies was the influence of long-distance trade. The Western African kingdoms had their own resources of iron, which in some cases were being worked by about 500 BCE, but they imported other metals, notably copper, together with horses, luxury manufactures, and above all salt, a vital commodity that was scarce in all of Western Africa except the coastlands. In exchange they could offer gold, ivory, certain agricultural commodities, and slaves. The exchange across the Sahara of such commodities probably goes back to times before the establishment of the modern desert. The emergence of the desert did not lead to the cessation of the trade but meant that its surviving pastoralists were encouraged to organize regular trans-Saharan expeditions for trade and plunder. It is known from Herodotus and other classical authors and from surviving rock engravings in the desert that horse-drawn chariots were in use in the Sahara by about 500 BCE. Chariots would have been used for short raids rather than for trans-Saharan trade. But the fact that the engravings are deployed along two principal lines, from the Fezzan and southern Morocco toward the upper Niger and Senegal rivers, suggests a North African interest in the alluvial gold of these rivers. This could well have occasioned the 6th century Carthaginian expedition led by Hanno to explore the possibility of direct sea trade with Western Africa along the Atlantic coast. Despite this expedition, the Carthaginians do not seem to have been capable of opening up a regular sea trade with Western Africa. The links with Western Africa remained firmly in the hands of the Saharan groups, although, at about the beginning of the Common Era, camels and other pack animals came into use to supplant the horse-drawn vehicles. The profits to be obtained by distributing Saharan and Mediterranean produce in Western Africa, and by controlling the collection and export of the Western African commodities that were exchanged for them, must have been a powerful factor in encouraging the kings of communities on the southern fringes of the Sahara to extend their rule by conquest over adjacent similar communities. Control over more extensive territories meant that by tribute and taxation they could acquire greater stocks of goods for exchange with North Africa and the Sahara and more clients and slaves to extend their power at the expense of their neighbors. Some of their increased human power could be mounted on horses, obtained from the Saharan trade, to increase the mobility and power of their armed forces over the open savannas. It is tolerably certain that the power of the kings of ancient Ghana, controlling the export of gold from the Senegal and Niger valleys, was built up in this way. Thank you for watching this video.